lead-based hazards pamphlet. So today we're going to talk about lead-based hazards and the lead-based paint disclosures pamphlet. I'm going to start off with kind of the background on how to get to where I am on this as well. So if you're following along at home, you can follow from here, orforms.org. This is the website. If you went onto the website in the past, you'll note it's different. That's because it was updated. So this is kind of the final launch form that the platform is going to have. So this is where we've got all of our stuff for the forms and how to get to the forms and all those other things that you're going to use for forms. What we're going to do to get to the lead-based paint thing is if you click on top corner forms, it takes you to the get your forms thing and also preview forms. So we can click preview all forms, and that takes us to a drop box that has all the forms. Just like before, it was a quick and easy thing to get to. At this stage, it's now kind of 2 steps in to get to the preview area. So this is where we are going to start, is the preview. I'm going to begin with the residential real estate purchase and sale agreement. We're going to look specifically at the lead-based hazards sections of this. So on the purchase and sale agreement, there are a handful of areas where lead-based hazards do arise. And you'll note that this is lead-based paint. Why do we call it lead-based paint instead of lead-based hazards? I've got up here, and this is more information than most people ever want to deal with. This is 40 CFR Code of Federal Regulations, Part 745, which is part of what the lead-based hazards and lead-based paint poisoning act of I think 2006 is when the Poisoning Act happened, and the Lead-Based Hazards Act was, I want to say 93 is when they passed that. This is where all of your lead-based paint protections come from, all the protections that a buyer has against the dangers of lead in the home or lead in their soil or in their waters or whatnot. It comes from this chunk of the federal statutes. Essentially, there's a statute in the laws that says the EPA gets to create regulations that deal with lead and protection of people's health and safety when it comes to overexposure of lead, and that has been manifested in this portion of the Code of Federal Regulations as guidelines and guidance by the EPA on how you're supposed to address lead. Now, when we talk about lead-based paint, previously all your forms had said the lead-based paint disclosures and whatnot. Why are we calling it Oregon Realtors? Why is it a lead-based hazard addendum rather than lead-based paint? That's because a lead-based paint hazard under federal law is defined as a condition that causes exposure to lead or lead from lead-contaminated dust, lead-contaminated soil, or lead-contaminated paint that is deteriorated or present in accessible surfaces, friction surfaces, or impact surfaces that result in adverse human health effects as established by the appropriate federal agency. Now, you will note a lead-based paint hazard is only 1/3 of it is lead-based actual paint. It's not just paint chips. It's more than the paint chips. It's lead in the dust, lead in the soil, and lead in the paint. What this means is if you have a protection, a right to inspect property for lead-based paint hazards, you can look for lead pipes. You can look for lead in the soil that would kill crops. If you're growing potatoes and they bring lead into them, it causes damage to your. That stuff is a valid inspection because federal law defines lead-based paint hazards as more than just lead-based paint. Which is why in our forms we changed the name from lead-based paint addendum to the lead-based hazard addendum. This is what you see if you look at the guidance from the EPA and HUD. They're starting to move away from the word lead-based paint towards lead-based hazard, in large part if you followed the news in the last decade or so. Places like Flint, Michigan, where there was lead in the water, that's a lead hazard. The EPA is absolutely certain that you are not supposed to be buying houses where there's lead in the water, but because everyone understood this Disclosures Act is only applying to lead-based paint, they're now being more bullish on broadening the definition out to include more than just paint, to include lead-based hazards. And so in the interest of consumers, in the interest of brokers, we've shifted the name to be lead-based hazard, more in reflection of the actual definitions at federal law than the actual word lead-based paint. So when we talk about lead-based paint, what does it apply to? Lead-based paint, like the laws related to lead-based paint, only apply to what's called target housing. Target housing is where this section right here on line 47 of our purchase and sale agreement comes in. We'll zoom in a little bit so people's eyes don't strain. On line 47, a lead-based hazard is any kind of it's the target housing, which is a home built before January 1st, 1978. Once after 78, there started being more restrictive procedures on how to build that included less lead paint. That's not to say that lead paint wasn't used after January 1st, 1978, but only that there was more of kind of a federal regulatory body in place that stopped people from using it as often. And so the general idea that the EPA has is you should typically only find lead-based paint, or there should really only be lead-based paint in houses built before 78, when you started getting more restrictions on the usage of lead. And so what the target, all of these disclosures, these protections, these termination rights, they apply only to target housing, which is a home that was constructed prior to January 1st, 1978. If we want to go more in depth on what target housing is a housing constructed prior to 1978, except housing for the elderly or people with disabilities, or any zero-bedroom dwelling. Now, that makes it sound like you can have more lead in property that's made for the elderly or for disabled people. That's not the case. In the Americans with Disabilities Act and other acts that protect elderly Americans, they have actually more restrictive protections for access to lead. And then bedroom dwellings are separate in their own right as well, just by the way that we define this. It's like military barracks is a large part of zero bedroom dwellings. And they don't have the same protections. But in general, this means if it's housing constructed before 78. Now, that housing thing is important because we've gotten questions periodically. What happens if I, for example, have a mixed commercial residential building where the basement of the building is a Starbucks and the ceiling of the building is an apartment and someone's living in that apartment? Because there's housing in that apartment area above, the entire building is target housing. It's subject to this Lead-Based Paint Disclosures Act. You need to disclose the things that are required at law. So in general, on the form, if you get a home that is built before January 1st, 1978, you would check yes, and you will need the lead-based hazard addendum attached to your form. And there's another portion in this that does talk about lead hazards, and that is right here in the purchase and sale agreement. In this section, we talk about lead-based hazards contingency as it's built into the purchase and sale agreement. If there was a construction permit that was issued or construction of the home began prior to 1978, January 1st, the seller needs to provide the protect your family, or the lead-based hazard addendum, as well as, I'll pull this up, Form 10.3. 10.3 is the Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home. This is an EPA provided pamphlet. You've probably seen it. If you haven't seen it, now you're seeing it. It's if you're ever selling houses that are target housing, you need this pamphlet with it. So in our form, what we have is if the building was constructed and is considered target housing, you now need the hazard addendum and the pamphlet. They need to be given to the buyer prior to accepting the buyer's offer. So this prior to accepting buyer's offer can also be treated as at the moment of accepting buyer's offer. The EPA treats that as an acceptable answer as well. So if you, for example, are a seller, the buyer sends you an offer that has the pamphlet on it, as well as a fully filled out lead-based hazards addendum, and all the information is accurate, and the seller signs that purchase and sale agreement and sends it back to the buyer. Now there's delivery, now there's mutual acceptance. By sending the pamphlet and the addendum and attesting to their accuracy, the seller is delivering those documents to the buyer, and they've then fulfilled their rights under federal law. Why do we say prior to accepting buyer's offer? Because under federal law, 40 CFR 745-107A, the seller is technically obligated to provide all this information before the buyer is what's called obligated under the contract. That means if the buyer is locked into the contract and you haven't delivered the documents, you violated federal law. And that's bad. And the EPA will audit people for those violations, and there's a fine of up to $11,000 for every single instance of a violation. And so if you haven't been delivering the pamphlet, you've just been putting it on your listings and assuming the buyer will download it and look at it, that is a violation every time that's happened. And that means if you get audited by the EPA and they say, did you ever actually deliver the pamphlet? And you go, well, no, it was all on the listing. I'm sure they got it. The buyer's agent told me they got it. The EPA can go in and look at how many offers you've had that were built before 78 and say, well, you didn't deliver the pamphlet on any of these, and it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines that get levied against your brokerage for essentially violating federal law. So make sure you give these documents when you're supposed to. Prior to buyer's acceptance is the way you're supposed to do it. At the moment of buyer's acceptance and binding buyer to the deal, that's also acceptable under EPA regulation. Federal law requires that before being obligated under the contract, the seller has to disclose all of this various stuff. I'll get to it when we cover the lead-based hazard addendum, and they also have to give them the pamphlet. This is an EPA-approved pamphlet. There is a twist to this that isn't actually in writing here, but it's something that you should know for your information. The provision of the EPA pamphlet under federal law, there's no requirement that it be provided in the language that's understood by the person buying, but generally what the EPA has been saying in their guidance, as well as what HUD says, because they don't want it to be a fair housing violation, is if you have have someone that is contracting in a different language, for example, a buyer who has a translator that helps them with signing all the documents, you should provide your EPA pamphlet in exactly the language that the pamphlet is available in. So EPA required pamphlet, EPA required addendum, great. The way we've got it set up in the Oregon Realtors forms is if you don't receive the pamphlet or the addendum before closing, at any time the seller can or the buyer can terminate. So if you haven't given the buyer, if you're the seller and you haven't given the buyer the EPA required pamphlet and you haven't given the buyer the EPA required addendum, the buyer can terminate at any time until closing, simply by saying, I didn't get these documents, I want out. And that's valid because that way you avoid getting audited by the EPA. We've also got it set up so that if you deliver the documents late, if you're required to deliver the documents and you deliver them sometime after they're supposed to be delivered, which is essentially at the moment of contracting, the buyer has a right to terminate for a prompt period of time, which we define in our contract as no longer than 2 business days. So the buyer gets 2 options. If you've delivered all the documents on time, then great, they get to do their inspections. If you haven't delivered the documents on time, the buyer can just terminate at any time until they get the documents. Once they get the documents, they have 2 more days during which they can terminate because you delivered the documents late. Why is there that 2-day late delivery requirement put into this? That is expressly because the EPA has allowed other states to avoid audits by putting that type of a provision into the contract. It essentially says you're not obligated, and at no time were you obligated before you read and understood the documentation. And that is essentially why this is built in the way it is. The buyer can terminate until they get the documents. And once they get the documents, if they get them late after mutual acceptance, at any time after mutual acceptance, the buyer gets 2 more days that they can terminate on, expressly to prevent EPA audits from destroying brokerages. So from there, this is the lead-based hazards addendum. It's written in the following way. Essentially, we start with the lead warning statement. This is required under federal law, 40 CFR 745. I believe the lead warning statement is 107C. I might be wrong. 107A1 is the one that requires the lead warning statement. So this statement has to be there, which basically says, hey, buyer, be aware. There's some dangerous stuff that goes on if you've got lead in the property. It can poison children. It can poison all kinds of people. It can cause neurological damage. It's bad. So stay away from lead if possible. And we say that by signing the document, buyer represents that they understood and read this warning statement. The buyer has been given the statement. The seller can't guarantee that the buyer understands it. So we have the buyer's signature represent understanding. If your buyer doesn't understand it, they should ask their broker, what does this mean? And you should be able to explain it. Essentially that lead is bad and you don't want to be poisoned by lead. And so you should do inspections and look for lead presence in the property because it's dangerous to your health and your children's health and it is generally something that is not allowed under federal law. We then define lead hazards. This is the broadened definition of lead hazards. That's more than simply the definition that exists at the like lead-based paint standard. It is lead hazards are lead contaminated dust, lead contaminated soil, and lead contaminated on paint on those various surfaces. So if there is the presence of these leads, that's dangerous. Now, there is a broad description. If we want to go really deep down the rabbit hole, there's a technical amount of lead exposure that is required to make something a lead hazard. If you really want accurate descriptions of if something is a dangerous lead hazard or not, have a professional lead inspector have a look at the property. They have more understanding of the exact nuances and numbers and like parts per million that exist to make it a lead hazard. If you're just using one of those like Home Depot, like wipe it, if it's got lead, it turns red kind of strips, those sometimes will give you false positives because they can be more accurate or more sensitive than the EPA requires the tests to be. So just be aware that while lead hazard is not defined, there are more granular definitions that a professional inspector will know. With that said, if a buyer just does the wipe it, and if it shows red, then it's lead hazard, you may find that buyer will still terminate, and they're in the right under federal law because they have a right to terminate for the presence of lead, not for a presence of lead in a certain like dangerous capacity. We have the connection here to the EPA pamphlet. This is the Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home pamphlet. We give you a link to the actual EPA website that has the pamphlet on it. This link is not sufficient as delivery. Just giving this document to someone and saying, yeah, there's a link, you can get to the document. That's not delivery of the document, because if we click on that link, it just takes you to where the EPA provides the pamphlet in various languages. There are 12 languages it's available in: Spanish, Arabic, French, Chinese, traditional Chinese, so like Cantonese and Mandarin, Korean, Polish, Russian, Somali, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. So it's available in many languages. And if you've got a client that is using a translator to understand the concept of the rest of the contract, you should provide this document to them in the language that they have, that they're translating it into. So we give you this link just in case you've got one of those sort of fringe scenarios where someone is using a translator and you know of it and you know that you need to deliver the document in a different language. In that case, this link is here. Otherwise, document 10.3 in our library is the English pamphlet that you can provide to a client. From there, we tell you that if the buyer does not receive the pamphlet along with the lead hazard addendum, buyer can terminate at any point before closing. That's to prevent audits. It's because federal law requires it. And if the buyer receives the pamphlet and the addendum at any point after mutual acceptance, they'll have 2 business days to terminate following reception of those documents. If the buyer does not terminate within those 2 business days, their right has sunset and they do not have a right to terminate anymore. So it's a use it or lose it right to terminate if you get the documents late. So if 3 days later into the contract, the seller finally delivers the pamphlet to the buyer gets 2 days to terminate, but they can't wait 28 days and then say, actually, seller, you delivered that pamphlet late, so I'm going to terminate this contract. You had your chance. It was 2 days after the documents were all delivered post mutual acceptance. The buyer is supposed to sign here or initial here to represent that they have received the informational pamphlet. Their initials here are not sufficient as a proof that you have delivered the pamphlet. So we get questions periodically where someone says, well, if the buyer just initials that, but I didn't give them the pamphlet, then they got the pamphlet, right? That's what the EPA knows. That's not the way it works. At federal law, your requirement is as a seller is to deliver the pamphlet. So just because the buyer says, oh yeah, I got a pamphlet, doesn't mean that you have delivered it. You need to have something that you can prove that you have affirmatively done as a seller to show that you have delivered the pamphlet. Even if the buyer has already received it or they said they received it, you need to do something for your sake to deliver the pamphlet. So this is for the buyer's file and for the seller's file, but you should, if you're a seller's agent, make sure you're delivering the document. Don't just rely on these initials to say, oh yeah, it's probably fine. There are also seller's disclosures. These are required under 40 CFR 745-107A2 and A3, which require that the seller disclose knowledge of any presence of lead on the property that they find. So if they know of lead hazards on the property, they need to explain the basis, location, and the condition of that lead-based paint or lead-based hazard. So if it's it's lead paint or it's lead pipes, you should tell them if you know about it. I see a question in the chat. Does delivery to buyer's agent, is that counted as delivery to the buyer? Yes. So delivery to the buyer's agent is treated as co-equal with delivery to the buyer, especially for this law. There's a further federal standard that in the lead hazard stuff that says if you're giving it to the buyer's agent that's been deputized to receive documents for that buyer, yeah, that's delivery. If it's a super limited agent that only has the right to provide information or provide a little bit of assistance or help, like a transaction coordinator, for example, who is not a licensed a licensee, they just alphabetize stuff, and you sent the email to that unlicensed transaction coordinator who doesn't have a representation agreement with that buyer, then you might have a different argument. In most cases, the courts will look at that and the EPA will look at it and say, well, the coordinator sent it to the agent, so it was received, and laterally will consider that as delivery. But generally, I would say deliver it to either the buyer or the buyer's agent. In either case, that is sufficient as delivery, but you, as the seller or the seller's agent, you need to be delivering those documents. The seller also has other options to either, when they've checked this first box, to say, yes, I know about lead, where they can say, I've given the buyer copies of all of the evaluation reports I have, or I don't have any evaluation reports and records. A lot of sellers will not have reports or records. They might just have something where it's like, oh yeah, I remember my uncle put in a lead pipe in the 60s. That might be the case. If that's what you know, write it in this section. If you actually have an evaluation or a report, that needs to be provided. That's a requirement that you provide the copies of those documents that you have. If the seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based hazards, they can check this next box down here. Knowledge, keep in mind, knowledge is an actual knowledge standard, so that means the seller has to know about it. It can't just be something where their cousin came in one day and said, wow, that pipe looks like it's made of lead. And you say, wow, that's interesting. If you don't know that it's lead, that's not knowledge. Just someone giving you a rumor or telling you, I've heard that in this neighborhood houses were built with lead pipes. That's not knowledge. You might still want to disclose that information. Say, hey, the neighbor told me when I moved in that all the houses here were built with lead pipes. I've never had it looked into. That's not knowledge, but it is a good thing to disclose because you don't want to have even a frivolous misrepresentation lawsuit is a hassle for a seller. So again, we have a place here for the initialing by the buyer that says I received all of the documents I'm supposed to. Keep in mind, the delivery requirement is one that's at federal law for the seller to deliver. It has nothing to do with the buyer initialing and acknowledging. It has to do with the seller literally delivering it. So for your sake as a seller, deliver the documents even if the buyer initials this because they said, don't worry about it, I'll initial it anyways. You need to deliver these things or else you're violating federal law. So this is here for your file, but it's not an absolute paper shield. Lastly, you've got these areas here for the lead hazard inspection. This is the kind of meat and potatoes of this lead hazard document. So the lead hazard inspection, you have 3 options here. You can check to take 10 calendar days. Why is it calendar days as a default? That's because that's what the federal law gave us. It's obnoxious. We wish this wasn't the case. This is the standard that's given at ORS 40 CFR 745-110A. They give you this 10 calendar day standard rather than business days, which is how everyone else does every one of these short time frames or 10-day things. So 10 calendar days after mutual acceptance, the buyer can look into the document. We've had people ask, where in the federal law are you allowed to modify away from calendar days? Can you prove it to us? Yes. 40 CFR 745A allows either 10 calendar days or a mutually agreed upon timeline or waiver. All 3 of those are permitted as a timeline under specifically the Code of Federal Regulations that regulates this. So you are allowed to choose a set number of days. It doesn't have to be calendar days. It can be a set number of business days, or the buyer can waive the right to conduct an inspection. That is allowed at federal law. So what we have on this is by signing below, the buyer acknowledges that they have received an opportunity to conduct these risk reports. So the buyer has at least had their chance to conduct a lead hazard inspection of some kind. They need to be given that under federal law, and that inspection is for the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based hazards. If you're doing this lead hazard inspection and you find something wrong with the house, like wrong with the shingling that has nothing to do with the inspection, this right of inspection does not allow you to terminate. It's a completely separate thing. This only allows inspection and termination for the presence of lead-based paint and lead-based hazards. As far as the actual scheduling of costs and whatnot, the buyer is going to be solely responsible for all of the scheduling and all of the costs involved in these lead hazard inspections. So if the buyer is hiring a professional to go in and look at this stuff, the buyer has got to pay for that professional. If the buyer only wants to do one of those little swipe tabs from Home Depot to see if there's lead, that's fine. You can do that, and the buyer's paying for that. It's just not necessarily as accurate. The buyer might be losing out on a house because the thing is too sensitive and it says, oh my God, there's lead here. And it's like, well, yeah, but it's not enough to ever damage a person. Until closing, or if the transaction is terminated for up to 10 days after that, the seller can request these inspection reports. So if the buyer gets a professional to inspect the property, our contract allows that seller, if the buyer terminates, for example, they say, well, my goodness, there's lead here, I'm out. The seller can say, can I get a copy of those reports because I want to fix this before the next buyer comes along and terminates because of lead. And at that point, the buyer is obligated under this contract to provide copies of these lead reports, evaluations, or assessments. They are supposed to deliver these over to the seller, and under contract, they are obligated to. If the buyer does lead paint or lead hazard evaluations, inspections, and whatnot, and they are dissatisfied for some reason, and this is the language that exists at in the federal regulatory code, the buyer is allowed to terminate, cancel the contract based on their dissatisfaction. So if you don't like it, if you're a buyer and you looked for lead and you found it, at that point you're allowed to end the contract. You have that right to end the lead hazard period, or you have until the end of the lead hazard inspection period, or until the end of the due diligence period, whichever is later, to agree to various repairs for these lead hazards. So if you take your 10 calendar day lead hazard inspection, it starts on a Saturday and it ends, what would that be at that point? Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Friday, like a Monday the next week. Theoretically, even if you had a 10 business day inspection period or due diligence period, you have 4 more business days in that due diligence period. Up until the end of that due diligence period, the buyer can discuss with the seller what repairs they want. So whichever one is later, they have until the end of that later inspection diligence period to request various repairs. This may mean that there is some kind of a case where the seller says, look, I don't want to do the repairs. I just don't want to do it. And the buyer is, after the end of their lead hazard period, they can then terminate based on the diligence period. They can say, okay, well, diligence would normally have allowed me to terminate, so I'm going to terminate during the due diligence period. there's lead and I don't like it. That's a valid reason for termination. It can be done even beyond the end of the lead hazard inspection period because the due diligence period is generally longer than lead hazard inspections. If you are asking for various lead repairs, the seller doesn't have to do those, but in general, they probably should because they're going to be violating federal law if they don't have an agreement in place otherwise. Usually what this ends up looking like is there's some sort of a agreement to repair the lead or to mitigate the repair, or there's an agreement to either drop the purchase price by enough that the buyer has enough money to pay for whatever mitigation costs exist there, or possibly the buyer just says it's not important enough to me, I'll fix it on my own time. In any of those cases, if you got a statement by the buyer that says essentially I'm fine with I found lead but I don't care because I'm going to fix it myself, then the seller is usually out of the woods. Generally, what you're going to want as a broker, even though it's not required at federal law or at regulation, is a statement by the buyer. If they say, whatever, I'll mitigate this lead stuff on my own, get that in writing, because you don't want to have a situation where you get audited by the EPA and they say, so the buyer found lead and the seller didn't let them terminate. You go, no. The buyer actively didn't want to terminate. They sent me this letter. Get your ducks in a row as soon as you can in these processes. So get that printed out in writing if you possibly have a situation where a buyer says, I don't care about the mitigation. I just want the house. The lead pipes are quaint and antique and it makes the house cool, so I want them. If you've got that situation, then get it in writing, because it protects you from the later audit where they ask for all of your documentation and then they put you behind a desk and grill you about why there are missing documents. You'll note as well on this lead hazard addendum, there's an agent acknowledgement where the seller's agent has to acknowledge that the seller is aware of their obligations under federal law to comply with the lead hazards regulations. So 42 USC 4852 D4 is where we get this standard of like all of the obligations under 40 CFR 745. It's a daisy chain from statute to regulation to you as the broker. This is where the daisy chain begins. This is the federal law. This federal law says seller needs to understand their obligations. They have to understand what they need to do when you have these lead hazards that are on the property, and they need to be compliant, or at least understand and acknowledge that they are trying to be compliant in any of these hazard addendums that they sign. This is one of those required things that a seller signs, an acknowledgement, and the agent needs to acknowledge that they have basically said, hey client, you need to do these things. Here is all the stuff you have to do to be in compliance. By giving them this lead hazard addendum, because it's based entirely on language that is provided straight from the EPA, we can say the EPA will not audit you because using this document. It has everything the EPA wants and more. And so this is largely to ensure that you just don't get audited by the EPA or by HUD. And this language has to be there because it's in EPA's required documents. Lastly, you'll notice that there's a certification of accuracy. This is also required under the federal the Code of Regulations. The certification of accuracy is 40 CFR 745 113.7. You have to have this certificate that says, I understand that everything we've attached and everything we've put on this is accurate to the best of my knowledge. This is a best of your knowledge standard. So this doesn't mean that if your seller is lying to you and they say, no, there's no lead on this property, and you're an agent, just because there's lead on the property and your seller lied to you doesn't mean you violated the law by certifying to the accuracy here. You are certifying to the best of your knowledge, which comes from your seller, that the thing is true and accurate. If the seller tells you, hey, heads up, agent, there's lead on the property, but I'm going to lie about it, you should not be signing this document. In fact, you should be moving your way out away from that representation, because you're not supposed to be lying about these things. The certification of accuracy is to ensure that there's essentially no fraud or malfeasance that goes on. If you know there's lead on the property, you literally know, you've done a test on your own, you're like, whoa, this is lead, then you shouldn't be signing this document if it does not disclose the presence of that lead. This is one of the only documents in the entire library. Normally in a purchase and sale agreement, it's between the buyer and the seller, and the agents are just scriveners. You just write stuff down. This is one of the only documents where the agents have to sign and bind themselves to the terms of this addendum, because federal law essentially requires you to be bound on it. So everywhere else in the contract, it's just a buyer and a seller signing. In these documents, in this document in particular, agents from both the buyer and the seller also have to sign because federal law requires them to. From there, this is the pamphlet. It's pretty long. It's 20 pages long. It's been pretty cleanly written and pretty simple in the way that it's been written by the EPA. If you haven't read it before, if you're not familiar with it, you should go through this pamphlet on your own time. If you got questions, send them to the legal hotline. We did put one adaptation to this that is different from the actual EPA pamphlet. So if you're using Form 10.3 rather than the thing that you can collect off the website here, on 10.3 we've added buyer's initials in the very bottom section, so the buyer can initial the various pages. We put that there essentially as a way of being able to say, okay, if the buyer comes back to you as a buyer's agent, says, how was I supposed to know that that lead was dangerous and that there were the lead pipes that the seller disclosed could actually harm me? You can say, well, you signed the page that says it's dangerous, so you definitely at least looked at it, and you can then prove that you've both done your job and provided the information you are supposed to as an agent. That's the deep dive on lead hazards. This is kind of a short open house today because it's a deep dive just on lead hazards and the lead hazard addendum and these various documents. Are there questions at this point kind of more granular about the lead hazard structure or about the interpretation of these various documents?
I have a question for you on the lead-based paint pamphlet where the buyer initials all of the pages. It seems like best practices would be for the selling agent to get a copy of that back.
Yeah.
Would be the best case scenario. Now,
Okay.
with the seller's agent, your obligation as a seller is only to deliver the document. So just because the buyer doesn't read it after you've delivered it doesn't mean you're in violation as a seller.
Okay.
And so while best practice would be get this thing back from the buyer and make sure they've signed initialed every page so you can say, great, lovely, they got it. Your technical obligation under federal law ends upon you delivering the document. It doesn't matter if the buyer read it. It doesn't matter if they understood it. You did your job by delivering it.
So an email showing the attachment with the pamphlet would suffice as delivery?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
If you want to do the truly, truly deep dive at some point and you've got the time for it, 40 CFR 745 is the process for disclosure of lead paint. It's a bear of a section of the code, but if you really, really want to go in depth and understand the exact granular reasons, sometimes you'll get a client that wants to know the exact reasons why and the exact reason where. This is where all of the rules come from. 745.100, generally 113, 107, 113, and 118 are the three places in this section that have kind of all of the regulations that will apply to brokers and to sellers of houses. But technically everything from about 100 until I want to say about 118 is going to be applicable to you when you're a seller selling a target housing. There are a couple other adaptations on this that are kind of worth noting as well. So for example, a lead-based hazard addendum applies to target housing, which is housing built before 78. Theoretically, a floating home or a manufactured home that was built before 1978 is housing, which means if you have a one-bedroom manufactured home from 1977, you will also need the lead hazard addendum and the lead protections pamphlet in that instance because it is still technically target housing. The same will also apply for commercial structures, like we said, that are mixed-use commercial structures that were built before the certain time frame that are target housing as well. It does not apply to vacant land because there's no housing. So if you have an empty plot of land that has, I don't know, lead ingots buried in the ground and it's seeping into the soil, that's probably a brownfield site or a Superfund site, but that's not something that requires a lead hazard addendum and a lead hazard pamphlet because there's no housing involved in that process.
Somebody in our area here has a question. When I'm really ask that question.
Yeah, go for it.
So we lead paint on the home, but then it's repainted and they do the abatement. Do we need to retest it and have knowledge, or would we say we don't know?
Did you
Because
have
it
a,
goes-
did the abater give you a certificate?
The first time we had it tested, they test by the thickness, they give you a number. So when you paint over it, it may change it. It may not register as having lead paint. So
Yeah, the technical answer is based, and this is a very kind of deep answer that does not necessarily give exceptional guidance because it's going to be largely dependent on things. Technically, because lead-based paint is considered like surface coatings that are in excess of a certain amount per square centimeter, if you've got a thin coating of lead paint, it's not lead paint under federal law. That might still show with a lead hazard inspection. So if it's a thin coat of lead paint that they painted something over the top, then there's really no way of knowing that there's lead there, and that's generally not considered like lead paint. More than that, it's generally, and this is from a separate document that's not even from the statute. This is from a EPA guidance document. The paint has to be friable paint. So in the same way that when we talk about asbestos, we usually talk about friable asbestos, which is like, if you chip the thing, it can get up into the air, and that's when asbestos is dangerous, as opposed to like asbestos that's deeply encased in something or that has other surfaces around it. It's not really an asbestos hazard in the same way. Lead is treated similarly. Now, with that said, that is one where you would definitely want to contact the EPA and get a statement from them that says, oh yeah, if you have lead paint that has been painted over and it's non-friable paint, at that point it's not a hazard, because the statute doesn't really predict, or the guidance documents that they have at code don't predict non-friable paint. So when we were talking about what about if it's painted over, so this is HUD guidance document. So I'm on page 28 of the process. This is guidelines for evaluation and control of lead-based paint hazards in housing that's produced by HUD, specifically the Office of Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control. On page 28, they provide a little more guidance, and they say, the definition of a lead-based paint hazard under Title X. Specifically, it's any condition that causes exposure to lead from lead-contaminated dust, lead-contaminated soil, or lead-contaminated paint that is deteriorated or present in accessible surfaces, friction surfaces, or impact surfaces. Thus, under this definition, intact lead paint on walls and ceilings is not considered a hazard, although the condition of the paint should be monitored to ensure that it does not deteriorate. Now, that's the legal definition, but it's going to be really difficult to explain to a buyer why their concerns about lead paint are not valid if they find lead paint. If you're like, well, yeah, but this isn't like lead paint chips yet, so it's not dangerous yet, so you should be able to buy the house, right? That buyer is going to find a reason to terminate in most cases if they're truly concerned about the paint. And so while it is something where we'd say, yeah, it doesn't really apply, if the buyer does find this paint and they want to terminate based on the presence of lead-based paint, it's usually easier kind of for all parties involved if they are allowed to terminate because they were skittish about the paint in the first place. But with that said, you could pretty directly go down to this kind of guidance and say, seller, you have target housing. However, there is no friable hazardous lead paint on the property because it's not considered a hazard yet because it has been painted over in a condition that means the paint is not accessible on the surfaces. The Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990, VARA. This is now part of the buyer's advisory. It's there very intentionally because in 1990, Congress passed a law that said there are special protections, moral protections for artists that create visual works of art. This law lets the artist prevent any intentional distortion, mutilation, or other modification of their work in a way that could damage the artist's honor or reputation. With art, for artists, most damage to art is considered damage to the artist's reputation. Why is this now in the advisory? Because sometimes artists paint houses. If you have an artist that paints a mural on the wall in a house, and they expect that mural to stay the way it is, that artist can sue if the new buyer who takes control of that house destroys, damages, paints over the wall. So imagine for a second, you are a buyer or a buyer's agent. Your buyer wants to buy a house. They look in the house on the inspection, they walk through and they go, oh God, that's an ugly mural in the kitchen. The seller thought they were a budding artist and the seller painted some terrible thing on the kitchen wall that, flowers and orangutans and stuff. And you're like, that's weird. If your buyer goes, all right, whatever, I like the house except for the orangutan mural on the wall, I want to get rid of it. You can buy the house, that's fine, the buyer can buy it, but if they remove that artwork without the artist's permission, they can sometimes be in a lot of trouble. In cases of this, the damaged artist's work can be a $750,000 up to $300,000 work of art, or a lawsuit for each work of art that's damaged. And if you've done it willfully, if you knew that it was art by the other person that they didn't want to have destroyed and you destroy it anyways, up to $150,000 in damages. So if the seller says, I am so proud of this mural, I painted it when I was 35 and I moved into the house and it was my first mural that I painted, and now I'm a mural artist, and you go, oh, that's nice, and you buy the house and paint over it anyways, up to $150,000 in damages can be levied against you for having damaged or destroyed that artist's art. It's significant. The work of art, if it can be removed without destruction or damage of the thing, then you're supposed to give a good due diligence effort to inform the other party and say, hey, heads up, I'm going to be removing your artwork, or you're going to be removing your artwork. Please get rid of it. And then you need to give that person up to 90 days to remove the art. So they at least 90 days to remove the art. So you tell the artist, hey, usually this is for something where it's like a large painting that's on the wall. If it comes with the house, or a sculpture in the backyard or something like that, that's movable. If it came with the house and you're like, I'm going to get rid of this, you can give the artist a chance to go in and take control of it and take it away without it being destroyed. That's fine. But if you don't inform the artist and you just destroy it, that can be a violation of the artist's moral rights and can result in significant damage fines. What we advise in general is if there is art on the wall in the house, if there's a sculpture, if there's something that counts as art in the house, you should get a waiver from the artist if you can, that allows you to own, modify, and or destroy the work of art after you become the property owner. Get a waiver or something from the seller stating that they understand to the best of their knowledge there are no Visual Artists' Rights Act claims on that property, so they don't know of any claims on the art. And also just generally request information from your title insurance as to whether or not they will protect against VARA claims. We heard apparently in the Eugene area, there's a house that has this like oddly famous shower where there's just someone painted on the tiles, just a nude man. And that is something that a subsequent buyer might want to remove. It's relatively famous in Eugene as kind of like a counterculture thing. So if you did remove it, the artist could literally sue and get potentially tons of money. So if it's something minor, don't just tell your client, you can just slap a coat of paint over that thing and get rid of it, because the law doesn't necessarily allow that. This is VARA. It should be something that we've known about for a while. It's only really been put in the advisory right now. It's been in place since 1990. There are famous lawsuits where people have gotten significant damages for destroying a piece of art. The most famous one was in New York. There was a guy that bought an abandoned office complex that had been used for graffiti. Graffiti art, I would like you to know, was not commissioned. It's just a person painting the walls. This guy said, I'm going to whitewash the building that I now own. And when he was in the process of whitewashing the building, or planning to whitewash the building, these graffiti artists came out and said, whoa, we are artists and this is our art. And you can't destroy our art. The guy owns the building. And he said, no, I'm going to destroy your art because I own the building. I'm going to whitewash it. They took him to court over a VARA claim. The guy then, in the middle of the trial, whitewashed the building anyways, with the expectation that now it's moot because the art is gone. The court levied a $400 million end result lawsuit against this guy. He was hit with a $400 million fine because he destroyed art willfully when it belonged to another artist. So just be aware. It's in the advisory now, so that antennas can go up and you can know when something's potentially dangerous. Art is an oddly protected zone of law, and when art and property interface with one another, brokers can get in trouble, or clients get in trouble. And when clients get in trouble, the first person they blame is their broker. So be aware.